The rain hammered against the windows of the Cromwell Auction House in Boston, Massachusetts. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed a century of commerce, dozens of wealthy collectors sat in velvet chairs, their numbered paddles resting on their laps like weapons waiting to strike. Richard Ashford sat in the back row, his tailored navy suit crisp despite the humid October evening. At 63, he had everything a man could want: a pharmaceutical empire worth $2 billion, a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, and a reputation as one of the most successful businessmen on the East Coast. Yet lately, something gnawed at him. A hollowness he couldn't name, couldn't fill with another acquisition or another zero in his bank account. Lot 247, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing through the hall. A collection of World War II memorabilia from the estate of Margaret Eleanor Hayes, deceased. Includes letters, photographs, and personal effects from 1942 to 1945. Richard barely glanced up. He'd come for a rare manuscript, not war trinkets. "Do I hear 500, the auctioneer called. Silence. Richard found himself raising his paddle. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the boredom, or perhaps something else entirely. 500 to number 72, the auctioneer said, pointing at Richard. "Do I hear 6? More silence. The room had moved on, uninterested in the dusty past. "Sold to number 72 for $500. 20 minutes later, Richard stood in the auction house's back room, a cardboard box in his hands. It was surprisingly light. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, were stacks of letters bound with faded ribbon, a worn leather journal, and several photographs in cracked frames. "Mr. Ashford?" A young assistant appeared at his shoulder. "Would you like us to have this delivered to your residence?" "No," Richard said, surprising himself. "I'll take it now." That night, in his penthouse, Richard poured himself a scotch and sat at his mahogany desk. The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars. He opened the box carefully, as if it might contain something fragile, something alive. The first photograph he pulled out stopped his heart. It showed a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, standing in front of a factory. She wore coveralls and a bandana tied around her dark hair, her smile radiant despite the industrial backdrop. She held a wrench in one hand and had grease smudged on her cheek. Behind her, a massive B-17 bomber was being assembled, its silver body gleaming under work lights. But it wasn't the woman that made Richard's breath catch. It was the man standing beside her. He was tall, lean, wearing an Army Air Force's uniform. His arm was around the woman's shoulders, and he was looking at her, not at the camera, with an expression of such pure, unguarded love that it seemed to transcend the photograph itself. Richard flipped the photo over with trembling hands. In faded pencil, someone had written, "Eleanor and James. Boeing Plant 2, Seattle. June 1943. 3 days before he shipped out." Richard set down his scotch. His hands were shaking. He reached for another photograph. This one showed the same woman, older now, perhaps in her 70s, sitting in a modest living room. She held the first photograph in her hands, tears streaming down her weathered face. On the wall behind her hung a folded American flag in a triangular case. Richard's throat tightened. He opened the leather journal. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time itself. June 15, 1943. James leaves tomorrow. We have 3 days. 3 days to be husband and wife, 3 days to pretend this war doesn't exist, 3 days to build a lifetime of memories that must last forever. I am terrified. I am grateful. I am alive in ways I never knew possible. He made me promise something tonight. He made me promise that if he doesn't come back, I will live. Not just survive, live. Love again if I can. Have children. Grow old. Be happy. I promised him, even though the words felt like betrayal. How do you promise to forget someone who has become your very heartbeat? Richard read page after page, his eyes burning. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a love forged in the fires of war, intense, desperate, achingly beautiful. She wrote of working 16-hour shifts at the Boeing plant, of rationing in Victory Gardens, of the endless, gnawing fear that every knock on the door might bring a telegram edged in black. Then he found the letters. They were thin, written on government issue paper, postmarked from places with names that had become legend: North Africa, Italy, England, France. Richard opened one carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in his hands. My dearest Eleanor, I cannot tell you where I am, but I can tell you that every morning when I wake, you are my first thought. Every night when I close my eyes, you are my last. The guys in my squadron joke that I have your photograph taped to the inside of my bomber's cockpit. They're wrong. I have 3. We flew another mission today. I cannot speak of the details, but I can tell you this: in the moments when I am most afraid, when the flak is bursting around us and the sky is on fire, I think of you standing in front of that B-17, wrench in hand, grease on your cheek, building the very machine that keeps me alive. You asked me in your last letter if I am scared. The answer is yes. But not of dying. I am scared that I will never hold you again. That I will never see the way the morning light catches in your hair. That I will never hear you laugh at my terrible jokes. Stay strong, my love. This war cannot last forever. Yours always, James. Richard set the letter down. His vision was blurred. When had he started crying? He reached for another photograph and froze. It was a telegram, preserved behind glass like a museum piece. The words were stark, brutal in their efficiency. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that Captain James William Bennett has been reported missing in action over Germany since March 24, 1945. If further details or other information are received, you will be promptly notified. March 24, 1945. 2 weeks before Germany surrendered. 2 weeks. Richard's hands trembled as he searched through the remaining items. There had to be more. There had to be an ending. At the bottom of the box, he found a sealed envelope. It was addressed in different handwriting, masculine, strong. To whoever finds this, please read Eleanor's story. She never stopped waiting. She never stopped loving. And she never knew the truth. Richard tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and another photograph. The photograph showed an elderly man, perhaps 80, standing in front of a war memorial in France. He wore a veteran's cap and leaned heavily on a cane. His face was weathered, scarred, but his eyes. Richard looked closer. Those eyes. He grabbed the first photograph, the one of James in his uniform, and held them side by side. The same eyes. Richard's heart was pounding now. He read the letter with shaking hands. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was James Bennett's younger brother. James did not die in 1945. His plane was shot down over Germany, but he survived. He spent the last months of the war in a POW camp, his face and hands burned beyond recognition in the crash. When he was finally liberated, the army identified him through his dog tags, but James could barely remember his own name. The doctors said it was trauma, amnesia from the injuries. By the time his memory started to return, months had passed. He tried to contact Eleanor, but he'd been declared dead. We all thought, she had moved on. Remarried. Had the life he made her promise to live. James took a new name, started over in Montana. He never married. He worked as a mechanic until his hands gave out, then as a teacher. He lived alone in a cabin in the mountains. Every year on June 15, he would take out a photograph, the only one he had managed to keep, and he would remember. He died last year. In his final days, he asked me to find Eleanor. To tell her he never stopped loving her. To tell her he kept his promise too. He lived, even though living without her was the hardest thing he ever did. I searched for Eleanor for months. I finally found her obituary. She died 3 weeks before James, at 96 years old. She never remarried. She worked at that Boeing plant until it closed, then volunteered at veterans' hospitals for 40 years. She lived in the same small house in Seattle, surrounded by photographs and letters and memories.
She waited. They both waited. And they never knew.
Richard sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands. Around him, his penthouse, his empire of glass and steel and success suddenly felt like a mausoleum.
Cold. Empty. Meaningless. Two people had loved each other with everything they had.
And the world had torn them apart. And neither had ever known that the other had kept their promise, had stayed faithful, had waited. Richard looked at the photographs spread across his desk.
Eleanor and James, young and radiant, their whole lives ahead of them.
Eleanor in her 70s, still beautiful, still waiting. James in his 80s, scarred and alone, still remembering. For the first time in 30 years, Richard Ashford, billionaire, titan of industry, man who had everything, put his head in his hands and wept.
Richard didn't sleep that night.
He sat at his desk until dawn broke over Boston Harbor, reading every letter, studying every photograph, tracing the edges of Eleanor and James's tragedy with fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals but had never touched anything this real. At 6:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. His assistant, Patricia, her voice professionally chipper despite the early hour.
"Mr. Ashford, you have the board meeting at 9, lunch with the senator at noon, and the..." "Cancel everything," Richard said. Silence on the other end.
In 15 years, he had never cancelled anything.
"Sir?" "Everything, Patricia. For the next 2 weeks. Tell them it's a family emergency."
"But sir, you don't have any."
"Just do it."
He softened his tone.
"Please."
By 8 a.m., Richard was on a plane to Seattle. He traveled commercial, first class, but still, the first time in a decade he hadn't used his private jet. He needed time to think, to process, to understand why this story had grabbed him by the throat and wouldn't let go. The man in the seat beside him, a software engineer named Derek, tried to make conversation.
"Business or pleasure?" Derek asked, gesturing at Richard's expensive suit. Richard looked down at the photograph in his hands, Eleanor and James, radiant and doomed.
"Neither," he said quietly.
"I'm looking for the truth."
Seattle greeted him with drizzle and gray skies. Richard checked into the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, dropped his bag in the suite, and immediately headed out with Thomas Bennett's letter and an address he'd found in Eleanor's papers.
The house was in Ballard, a working-class neighborhood north of downtown.
Richard's driver, a local man named Marcus, navigated the narrow streets lined with modest craftsman homes built in the 1920s and 30s. "This is it," Marcus said, pulling up to a small blue house with white trim. The paint was faded, the garden overgrown, but the structure was solid. A for sale sign swayed in the breeze. Richard stood on the sidewalk, staring. Eleanor had lived here. Had waited here.
Had died here, never knowing. "You want me to wait?" Marcus asked.
"Yes.
This might take a while."
The realtor, a woman named Cheryl Mendoza, met him at the door 20 minutes later. She was in her 50s, efficient and professional, but her smile faded when she saw Richard's expression.
"Are you interested in the property, Mr. Ashford?"
She'd clearly looked him up after his call. "I'm interested in its history," Richard said. "The woman who lived here. Eleanor Hayes." Cheryl's expression shifted, became softer.
"You knew Mrs. Hayes?" "No. But I need to know about her." "Please."
Cheryl studied him for a long moment, then nodded.
"Come in."
The house was exactly as Eleanor had left it, frozen in time. The furniture was old but well-maintained, a floral couch from the 1970s, a television from the 90s, lace curtains that filtered the gray Seattle light into something almost holy. But it was the walls that made Richard's chest tighten.
Photographs. Hundreds of them. Eleanor's entire life documented in frames of every size and style. Eleanor as a young woman at the Boeing plant.
Eleanor with other Rosie the Riveters, their faces smudged with grease and pride.
Eleanor at veterans' hospitals, surrounded by old soldiers in wheelchairs.
Eleanor receiving awards for her volunteer work. And in the center of it all, above the fireplace, the photograph from 1943.
Eleanor and James.
The last moment before everything changed. She never married, Cheryl said quietly, standing beside Richard. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was like everyone's grandmother. Kind, generous, always baking cookies for the kids, always ready with a story. But there was a sadness in her, you know? Like she was living two lives, the one everyone could see, and another one, a secret one, that only she knew about. Did she ever talk about him? Richard asked, his voice rough. About James? Cheryl nodded. Once. I was maybe 10 years old. My family lived next door. I asked her why she never got married, why she lived alone. She smiled. God, she had the saddest smile, and she said, I am married, sweetheart. My husband just had to leave for a very long time. Richard closed his eyes. I asked her if he was coming back. She said, I don't know. But I'll be here if he does. Richard walked through the house slowly, reverently. The bedroom was sparse, a single bed with a handmade quilt, a nightstand with a reading lamp, and one photograph in a simple wooden frame. James in his uniform, young and alive and full of hope. In the closet, Richard found boxes. More letters. More photographs. And something else. A wedding dress, wrapped in tissue paper, pristine and unworn. Oh God, Richard whispered. Cheryl appeared in the doorway. She bought that in June 1943. She was going to wear it when he came back from the war. Her voice broke. She kept it her whole life. Richard sank onto the bed, the dress in his hands. The fabric was yellowed but intact, saved with a care that spoke of hope that never died. Mr. Ashford, Cheryl said gently, may I ask why you're here? Why this matters to you? Richard looked up at her, the stranger who was being more honest with him than anyone in his life had been in years. Because, he said slowly, I spent my entire life building an empire. I have money, power, success. I've been married twice, both ended in divorce. I have a son I haven't spoken to in 3 years because I missed his childhood for board meetings. I have everything, Ms. Mendoza. And I have nothing. He held up the wedding dress. Eleanor Hayes had nothing. And she had everything. The next 3 days were a blur of research. Richard hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen, a former journalist who specialized in World War II history. Together, they dove into military records, newspaper archives, and veteran databases. They found James's service record. 23 bombing missions over Europe. Shot down on his 24th, March 24, 1945, near Nuremberg. Initially listed as MIA, then Kia 3 months later when no trace of him was found. But Thomas's letter said he'd survived. So where were the records? Sarah made calls, sent emails, pulled strings. On the third day, she burst into Richard's hotel suite with a file folder, her eyes bright with discovery. I found him, she said. But you're not going to believe this. She spread documents across the coffee table. Hospital records from a military facility in Virginia, 1945. A patient listed as John Doe number 47, severe burns, head trauma, memory loss. No identification except dog tags that were too damaged to read clearly. They identified him through partial dental records months later, Sarah explained. But by then, he'd been transferred to a veterans hospital in Montana. The paperwork was a mess, post-war chaos, thousands of wounded soldiers, bureaucratic nightmares. James Bennett was officially declared dead. This John Doe was eventually given a new identity, Michael James Carter. Michael Carter, Richard repeated. That's who he became? Sarah nodded. He lived in Whitefish, Montana. Worked as a mechanic, then taught shop class at the high school. Died February 2023, at 98 years old. February 2023. Richard felt his heart clench. Eleanor had died in January 2023. 3 weeks apart. Just as Thomas's letter had said. There's more, Sarah said quietly. She pulled out a photograph recent, taken at a veterans event. An elderly man in a wheelchair, his face scarred, his hands gnarled. But his eyes. Richard recognized those eyes. I spoke to people in Whitefish, Sarah continued. They all said the same thing. Michael Carter was a loner, kind but distant. Every June 15th, he would close his shop, drive up to the mountains, and disappear for the day. No one knew why. And every June 15th, he would come back looking broken. Like he'd been to hell and barely made it out. June 15th. The day James left for war. The day he said goodbye to Eleanor. He remembered, Richard whispered. Even when he couldn't remember his own name, he remembered that date. Sarah handed him another document. I also found this. It's from a lawyer in Whitefish. Michael Carter's will. Richard scanned it quickly, then stopped, his breath catching. He left everything to Eleanor Hayes, Sarah said softly. His house, his savings, about $127,000, and a letter. The lawyer tried to find her after he died, but by the time they located her address, she was already gone. The letter, Richard said urgently. Where is it? Still with the lawyer. I called him. He's willing to turn it over to someone who can ensure Eleanor's estate receives it properly. Sarah paused. That's you, apparently. You bought her effects at auction, which makes you the legal holder of her estate items. 2 days later, Richard stood in a small law office in Whitefish, Montana. The lawyer, an elderly man named Harold Pritchard, handed him a sealed envelope with trembling hands. I've been holding this for over a year, Harold said. Mike, that's what we all called him. He brought it to me in 2022, said it was the most important thing he'd ever written. Made me promise to find Eleanor, to make sure she got it. His eyes were wet. I tried, Mr. Ashford. God knows I tried. I know you did, Richard said gently. He waited until he was alone in his hotel room to open it. Outside, the Montana mountains rose against a brilliant blue sky, snow-capped and eternal. Inside, Richard sat on the bed and carefully unsealed the envelope. The handwriting was shaky but readable, the hand of an old man fighting against time. My dearest Eleanor. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and someone has finally found you. I pray it is not too late. I pray you are still alive, still in this world, still breathing the same air I breathe. I don't know where to begin, so I will begin with the truth. I survived. The crash, the war, the hell that followed. But I did not survive as James Bennett. That man died in the fire when my plane went down. The man who crawled from the wreckage had no face, no memory, no name. By the time I remembered you, by the time your face came back to me in dreams so vivid I would wake up weeping, they told me you were gone. They told me I had been dead for 2 years, that the woman I loved had surely moved on, remarried, built the life I had begged her to build. I almost looked for you anyway. But then I thought, what if they were right? What if you had found happiness? What if I came back, this burned and broken stranger, and destroyed the peace you had finally found? So I stayed away. I changed my name. I built a small life in a quiet place. And every single day, Eleanor, every single day for 78 years, I thought of you. I kept my promise. I lived. But I never loved again. How could I? You were the only love that mattered. You were the only love that was real. I have spent my life haunted by one question: did you wait for me? Or did you, as I hoped and feared, find someone else to love? If you did, then I am grateful. It means I did the right thing by staying away. It means you had happiness, and that is all I ever wanted for you. But if you didn't, if you waited, if you stayed faithful to a ghost, then I have failed you in the cruelest way possible. And I am sorrier than words can ever express. I love you, Eleanor Hayes. I loved you in 1943, I loved you in 1945, I have loved you every moment since. I will love you beyond death, beyond memory, beyond time itself. Wait for me, my darling. Wherever you are, wait for me. This time, I promise, I will find you. Forever yours, James. Richard sat motionless, the letter in his hands, tears streaming down his face. They had both waited. Both stayed faithful.
Both loved with everything they had. And neither had ever known.
Outside, the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the snow gold and crimson. Inside, Richard Ashford, who had spent his life chasing wealth and losing everything that mattered, finally understood what he had to do.
He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah Chen.
"Sarah," he said, his voice steady despite the tears.
"I need you to find Thomas Bennett. James's brother. I need to find him today." "Why?" Sarah asked.
Richard looked at the letter, at the photographs spread across his bed, at the evidence of a love that had transcended war and time and death itself.
"Because," he said, "they deserve to be together. And if I have to move heaven and earth to make that happen, then that's exactly what I'm going to do."
Thomas Bennett lived in Portland, Oregon, in a small assisted living facility called Meadowbrook Gardens. He was 89 years old, suffering from advanced heart disease, and according to the facility administrator, didn't receive many visitors. Richard arrived on a cold November morning, the kind of day where the Pacific Northwest sky seemed to press down on the earth like a gray blanket. He carried a leather portfolio containing every document, every photograph, every piece of Eleanor and James's story. The administrator, a compassionate woman named Diane Robertson, met him at the entrance. "Mr. Bennett doesn't get many visitors," she said as she led Richard down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and old age. "His wife passed away 5 years ago. They never had children. Most of his friends are gone." She paused outside a door. "He talks about his brother sometimes. James. He says he failed him." "He didn't fail anyone," Richard said quietly. Diane knocked gently, then opened the door. The room was small but comfortable, a single bed, a television, a window overlooking a garden where the last autumn leaves were falling. An elderly man sat in a wheelchair by the window, an oxygen tube in his nose, a blanket across his lap. His hands were spotted with age, trembling slightly. "Mr. Bennett?" Diane said softly. "You have a visitor." Thomas turned slowly. His eyes, pale blue, clouded with cataracts, studied Richard with confusion. "Do I know you?" His voice was weak, raspy. "No, sir," Richard said, stepping forward. "But I know your brother. I know James." Thomas's expression transformed. His eyes sharpened, focused. His hands gripped the wheelchair arms. "James? You knew James?" Richard pulled a chair close and sat down, setting the portfolio on his lap. "Mr. Bennett, I need to tell you something. Something about your brother and the woman he loved. Something that will break your heart and heal it at the same time." For the next hour, Richard told him everything. He showed him the photographs, the letters, Eleanor's journal, James's final letter. He explained the auction, the investigation, the parallel lives lived in separate worlds. Thomas wept silently, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "She waited," he whispered. "All those years, she waited." "They both did," Richard said. Thomas reached out with a shaking hand and touched the photograph of Eleanor and James, young and radiant. "I told him not to look for her. When he finally remembered, when he came to me in 1947, broken and desperate, I told him she'd moved on. I thought. God help me, I thought I was protecting him. I thought knowing she'd remarried would hurt less than the uncertainty." "You didn't know," Richard said gently. "I should have helped him search. I should have." Thomas's voice broke. "I stole their chance. Whatever chance they might have had. Or," Richard said carefully, "you gave them something else. You gave them both the ability to keep their promise. To stay faithful. To prove that love can survive anything, even the cruelest separation imaginable." Thomas looked up at him, his eyes swimming. "That's a kind way to see it." "It's the only way to see it," Richard said. He pulled out a document he'd prepared. "Mr. Bennett, I want to do something. With your permission, I want to tell their story. I want to create something that ensures Eleanor and James are never forgotten. That their love becomes immortal." Thomas studied the document, a proposal for a foundation, a memorial, a legacy. "Why?" Thomas asked.
Why does this matter to you? You never knew them.
Richard was quiet for a long moment. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the window like fingers seeking entrance.
Because, Richard finally said, I've lived my entire life the wrong way. I built an empire and lost a family. I chased success and forgot what mattered.
And then I found this photograph, and I saw two people who had nothing, no wealth, no power, no guarantee of tomorrow, but they had everything.
They had love. Real love. The kind that doesn't quit, doesn't compromise, doesn't fade.
He looked at Thomas directly.
I want to do something that matters.
For once in my life, I want to do something that's not about money or power or my own legacy.
I want to honor them. Both of them.
Thomas reached out and gripped Richard's hand with surprising strength. Then do it, he said. Tell their story. Make sure the world knows what real love looks like. The next 6 months became a whirlwind of purpose that Richard had never experienced before. He established the Eleanor Hayes and James Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting veterans and their families, preserving World War II history, and providing scholarships for young people studying history and nursing, Eleanor's two great passions. But more than that, he commissioned a memorial. It would be placed in Seattle, near the site where the Boeing Plant 2 had once stood. Richard hired the best sculptor in the country, a woman named Maria Gonzalez who specialized in public monuments. He showed her the photographs, the letters, the entire story. Maria wept when she read James's final letter. I'll do this, she said, but I won't charge you.
Some stories are sacred. This is one of them. The memorial took 4 months to complete. It was bronze, life-sized, exquisitely detailed. Eleanor stood in her coveralls and bandana, wrench in hand, grease on her cheek, exactly as she'd appeared in that first photograph. Beside her, James in his Army Air Forces uniform, his arm around her shoulders, looking at her with that same expression of pure, unguarded love. But Maria had added something else, something that made Richard's chest tighten when he first saw it. Their hands were joined, fingers intertwined. And on the base, carved in elegant letters, were words from James's final letter. Wait for me, my darling. Wherever you are, wait for me. This time, I promise, I will find you. Below that, Eleanor's words from her journal. How do you promise to forget someone who has become your very heartbeat? And finally, the dates, Eleanor Hayes, 1921 to 2023, and Captain James Bennett, 1920 to 2023. Separated by war. United by love. Together forever. The dedication ceremony was held on June 15, the anniversary of the day James had left for war, the day that both of them had remembered every year for the rest of their lives. More than 300 people attended. Veterans in their wheelchairs, many of them over 90, some who had known Eleanor from her volunteer work. Historians. Local officials. News crews from across the country. The story had captured the nation's imagination, a reminder of what love could be, should be, in a world that had grown cynical. Thomas Bennett was there, frail but determined, seated in the front row with oxygen and a nurse at his side. Richard sat beside him, no longer the billionaire in the tailored suit but a man in jeans and a simple jacket, holding the original photograph in his hands. When the time came for the unveiling, Richard walked to the podium. He looked out at the faces old and young, tearful and hopeful, and he understood, finally, what his life had been missing. I never met Eleanor Hayes, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. I never met James Bennett. But their story changed my life. It taught me that success isn't measured in money or power. It's measured in moments. In promises kept. In love that refuses to die. He held up the photograph. This is them. June 1943. 3 days before James shipped out. Look at their faces. Look at that joy, that hope, that certainty that love could survive anything. He paused, his throat tight. They were right. It did survive. Through war, through loss, through decades of separation and loneliness. Through bureaucratic failures and tragic misunderstandings. Through everything the world could throw at them, their love survived. Richard stepped aside, and the white cloth covering the memorial fell away. The crowd gasped. Several people began to cry openly.
Eleanor and James stood frozen in bronze, young and perfect and eternal. The Seattle drizzle began to fall, running down their metal faces like tears, and Richard thought it was perfect. Even the sky was weeping for them. Thomas Bennett, with great effort, rose from his wheelchair. His nurse tried to help him, but he waved her away. He shuffled forward slowly, painfully, until he stood before the memorial. He reached out and touched his brother's bronze hand. "I'm sorry, James," he whispered, his voice breaking.
"I'm so sorry I didn't help you find her."
Richard stepped beside him, steadying him.
"They're together now," he said softly. "Look at them. They're finally together." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes. Yes, they are." The story didn't end there.
In the weeks following the dedication, something remarkable happened.
The foundation began receiving letters, hundreds of them, then thousands. Stories from other veterans, other loves torn apart by war. Children and grandchildren of World War II soldiers, sharing photographs and letters they'd found in attics and basements.
Stories that had been silent for decades, suddenly given voice.
Richard read every single letter.
He hired a staff to help document these stories, to preserve them, to ensure that an entire generation's love and sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten.
And then, 3 months after the dedication, Richard received a call from Sarah Chen.
"You need to see this," she said, her voice strange, excited and somber at once. She arrived at his office, not the penthouse, but a small space near the memorial, where Richard now worked most days, with a folder and a woman in her 70s.
"Mr. Ashford," Sarah said, "this is Helen Morrison. She has something to show you."
Helen was elegant, composed, but her hands shook as she opened her purse and pulled out a photograph.
It showed 2 graves, side by side, in a cemetery Richard didn't recognize. The headstones were simple, identical. One read, Eleanor Hayes, 1921 to 2023. She waited. The other, Michael James Carter, 1920 to 2023. He remembered.
"I'm the director of Riverside Cemetery in Whitefish, Montana," Helen said quietly. "When your memorial was dedicated, when the story hit the news, I realized something. Michael Carter, James Bennett, he's buried in our cemetery. He bought 2 plots in 1985. Side by side."
Richard's heart stopped. 2 plots?
Helen nodded, tears in her eyes.
The other one was empty. But there was a name on the headstone. Eleanor Hayes.
He'd had it carved 40 years ago.
He'd been waiting for her. Richard couldn't breathe.
He bought her a grave.
Next to his. Yes. And 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Eleanor Hayes' estate attorney.
She'd left instructions in her will, written in 2015. She wanted to be cremated, and her ashes.
Helen's voice broke.
Her ashes were to be taken to Whitefish, Montana, to Riverside Cemetery, to be buried next to a man named Michael James Carter, who she believed was her husband, James Bennett.
Sarah Chen was crying openly now.
Richard, Eleanor figured it out. Somehow, in her last years, she found him.
She knew. But how?
Richard whispered. Helen pulled out another document, a letter, dated 2014, addressed to Eleanor Hayes. Michael Carter had written to her, Helen explained. After all those years, in 2014, when he was 94 years old, he finally gathered the courage. He sent her this letter.
Just one. Asking if she was the Eleanor Hayes who had worked at the Boeing plant in 1943. Asking if she remembered a man named James Bennett.
Richard took the letter with shaking hands.
Dear Mrs. Hayes. You don't know me.
My name is Michael Carter, but a very long time ago, I had a different name. If you are the Eleanor I knew, if you are the woman I loved with my whole heart, then you will understand what I am about to tell you. I survived the crash. I survived the war. But I didn't survive as the man you knew. I was told you had moved on, and I believed it because I wanted you to be happy more than I wanted anything in the world. I am 94 years old now.
I am dying. And before I go, I need to know, did you wait for me? Or did you, as I hoped, find happiness? If you did not wait, please don't tell me. Let me believe you had a beautiful life. But if you did wait, if by some miracle you stayed faithful to a ghost, then please, Eleanor, write back. Let me know that our love was real. That it mattered. That it survived. I have bought 2 plots in a cemetery in Montana. Side by side. One has my name. The other has yours. It is my dearest hope that someday, somehow, we will rest together. I love you. I never stopped. James. Did she write back? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Helen nodded. She did. I found the letter in Michael's effects after he died. He'd kept it under his pillow. She handed Richard another letter. The handwriting was shaky, the writing of a very old woman, but clear. My dearest James. Yes. It's me. It's your Eleanor. I waited. Every day for 71 years, I waited. I never stopped believing you would come home. And now I know you did come home. You were just too far away for me to find you. I am 93 years old. My hands shake, my eyes are failing, but my heart is the same as it was when you left me in June 1943. It still beats only for you. I have arranged for my ashes to be buried beside you. We were married in spirit if not in law. We are husband and wife. And nothing, not war, not time, not death itself, can change that. Wait for me, my love. Just a little longer. I'm coming home. Forever yours, Eleanor. The letter was dated November 2014. Eleanor had lived 8 more years, knowing the truth, knowing that James had survived, that he had loved her, that he had been waiting. And James had lived until February 2023, knowing that Eleanor had waited, that she had been faithful, that their love had been real. They had both known. Not for their whole lives, but for those final precious years, they had both known. They're together now, Helen said softly. I buried Eleanor's ashes 3 weeks ago, on what would have been their 80th wedding anniversary. Side by side, just as they wanted. Richard stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the bronze memorial gleamed in the afternoon sun. Eleanor and James, forever young, forever in love. They got their happy ending, Sarah said, standing beside him. No, Richard said, smiling through tears. They got something better. They got proof that real love exists. That it's worth waiting for. That it's worth believing in, even when the whole world tells you to give up. He turned to Helen. I want to do something. I want to create a second memorial, in Whitefish. At their graves. So people know the whole story. I think they'd like that, Helen said. 6 months later, Richard stood in Riverside Cemetery in Whitefish, Montana. It was June 15th again, the anniversary that had defined 2 lives. The second memorial was smaller, more intimate than the Seattle one. 2 bronze plaques set into the ground between the graves, engraved with their story, the full story, from beginning to end. Here lie Eleanor Hayes and James William Bennett, known in life as Michael Carter. Married in spirit, separated by war, reunited in death. They waited 71 years. They never stopped loving. They proved that real love never dies. The dedication was small, just a few dozen people. Thomas Bennett had passed away 2 months earlier, at peace knowing his brother's story had been told. But many of the people who had written to the foundation came. Veterans. Families. People who had been moved by the story, who had been reminded that love, real, sacrificial, enduring love, still existed. Richard stood before the graves as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In his hands, he held the original photograph Eleanor and James, June 1943, 3 days before the world tore them apart. I did it, he said quietly, speaking to 2 people who couldn't hear him but somehow, he believed, were listening. I told your story. And it mattered. It changed people. It changed me.
He knelt and placed the photograph between the graves, protected in a weatherproof frame. "You were right, James. Love does survive. It survives everything. And Eleanor," his voice broke, "you were right too. You can't forget someone who becomes your heartbeat." Richard stayed there as darkness fell, as stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace. Not because he'd accomplished something great, but because he'd honored something greater than himself. Richard Ashford returned to Boston a different man. He sold his pharmaceutical company and used the proceeds to expand the foundation. He reached out to his son, Daniel, for the first time in years. It was awkward, painful, but real, more real than any conversation they'd ever had. "I'm sorry," Richard told him over coffee in a small cafe, not a boardroom. "I missed your life. I chose success over you, and that was the greatest mistake I've ever made." Daniel, 32 years old with his father's eyes but his mother's kindness, studied him for a long moment. "What changed?" he asked. Richard pulled out his phone and showed him the memorial Eleanor and James, bronze and eternal. "I found a photograph," Richard said. "And it taught me what matters. What really matters." It took time, months of careful rebuilding, of showing up, of being present, but slowly, Richard and Daniel found their way back to each other. Richard met his grandson for the first time, a 3-year-old boy named James. "James?" Richard asked, his throat tight. "After a hero," Daniel said, showing him his phone, the news story about the memorial. "After the kind of man who knew what love meant." Richard held his grandson and wept. 3 years later, on June 15, Richard stood once again before the Seattle Memorial. He came every year now, always on this date, always at sunset. The memorial had become a pilgrimage site. People left flowers, letters, photographs of their own loved ones. Veterans came to salute. Young couples came to make promises to each other, inspired by a love that had transcended death. Richard was 70 now. His hair was white, his face lined, but his eyes were clear. Beside him stood Daniel and his wife, holding young James, now 6 years old. "Grandpa," James asked, "why do we come here?" Richard knelt down, looking into his grandson's eyes so full of innocence, of possibility. "Because," he said gently, "these two people taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. That love is the only thing that matters. Not money, not power, not success. Just love. Real, true, faithful love." "Did they get married?" James asked. "They did," Richard said, smiling. "Not in a church, not with a piece of paper. But in every way that mattered, yes. They were married. And they lived happily ever after?" Richard looked up at the memorial Eleanor and James, forever young, forever faithful, their bronze hands intertwined. "No," he said softly. "They lived separately, in sadness and loneliness, for most of their lives. But they loved faithfully ever after. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything." Young James thought about this, his face serious. "I want to love like that someday." Richard pulled him close. "Then remember this story. Remember Eleanor and James. Remember that real love waits. Real love endures. Real love never, ever gives up." As the sun set over Seattle, painting the memorial in shades of gold, Richard Ashford, who had once had everything and nothing, stood with his family and felt, for the first time in his life, truly wealthy. Not because of his bank account, but because he'd learned what mattered. Because he'd honored a love that deserved to be remembered. Because he'd finally, gotten his priorities right. The wind picked up, rustling the flowers left at the memorial's base. And for just a moment, Richard could have sworn he heard something, laughter, young and joyful, echoing from another time. Eleanor and James, together at last. Somewhere beyond the bronze, beyond the memorial, beyond even death itself, they were dancing. And they would dance forever.